Miss Marple and the Murder Beneath the Magnolia Tree, Chapter 1. The Garden Party. The magnificent magnolia tree in the center of Rosemount's village green had been the pride of Little Fenwick for over a century. Its creamy white blossoms, large as dinner plates, cast dappled shadows across the carefully manicured lawn where the annual midsummer garden party was in full swing. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably in a wicker chair beneath the tree's generous canopy, watched the familiar tableau of village life unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed such scenes countless times before. "More tea, Miss Marple?" inquired Mrs. Dolly Bantry, the party's hostess, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the warm June afternoon. The elegant woman had inherited Rosemount House from her late husband 3 years prior, and had thrown herself into village social activities with the enthusiasm of someone desperate to belong. "How kind of you, dear," Miss Marple replied, extending her delicate china cup. Her keen blue eyes, however, remained fixed on the guests scattered across the lawn, each group engaged in the sort of polite conversation that revealed far more than its participants intended. Near the ornate fountain, the vicar, Reverend Timothy Ashworth, was deep in animated discussion with Dr. Marcus Pemberton about the proposed restoration of the church bell tower. Both men wore expressions of barely concealed frustration, the kind that suggested their disagreement ran deeper than mere architectural preferences. Miss Marple had noticed how the doctor's jaw tightened whenever the vicar spoke, and how Reverend Ashworth's hands clenched behind his back when he thought no one was looking. "Such a lovely turnout this year," Mrs. Bantry continued, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple. "Though I do worry about poor Violet Ashworth. She seems rather distracted lately." Miss Marple followed her hostess's gaze to where the vicar's wife stood apart from the other ladies, absently shredding a paper napkin while staring at something or someone across the garden. Violet Ashworth had once been considered the beauty of Little Fenwick, but at 42, her face bore the pinched look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for her slender shoulders. "Marriage can be trying," Miss Marple observed mildly, though her attention had shifted to a more intriguing sight. Mrs. Celia Blackwood, the village's self-appointed moral guardian, was engaged in what appeared to be a heated, whispered exchange with young Geoffrey Starling, the handsome groundskeeper who maintained the village green. Geoffrey, barely 25 and possessed of the sort of easy charm that made middle-aged women flutter, was shaking his head emphatically while Mrs. Blackwood, formidable widow in her 60s, gestured sharply toward the church. Whatever they were discussing, it was clearly causing both parties considerable distress. "I say, that's rather odd," murmured Colonel James Hartwell, approaching the ladies with a plate of cucumber sandwiches. The retired military man, distinguished despite his 70 years, had been squinting through his wire-rimmed spectacles at something near the far end of the garden. "Is that young Starling arguing with Mrs. Blackwood?" "Can't imagine. What about the boys? As mild as milk." "Appearances can be deceiving, Colonel," Miss Marple replied softly, accepting a sandwich with a grateful smile. "In my experience, the mildest people often harbor the strongest passions." Before the Colonel could respond, a sharp cry pierced the gentle murmur of conversation. Mrs. Bantry's prized Persian cat, Duchess, had somehow become entangled in the lower branches of the magnolia tree and was yowling pitifully for rescue. "Oh, the poor dear," exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, rising hastily from her chair. Geoffrey, could you possibly?" But the young groundskeeper was already striding across the lawn, his earlier conversation with Mrs. Blackwood apparently forgotten. With practiced ease, he climbed the sturdy trunk and carefully extracted the frightened feline from the tangle of branches and blossoms. "There you are, Your Majesty," he said with a grin, presenting the indignant cat to her relieved owner. "No harm done." The small drama had drawn most of the party guests toward the magnolia tree, creating a cheerful cluster of concerned faces and gentle laughter. Miss Marple noticed, however, that Mrs. Blackwood had taken advantage of the distraction to slip away toward the church, her black handbag clutched tightly against her chest. "What a hero you are, Geoffrey," gushed Miss Patricia Henley, the village librarian, her cheeks pink with more than just the afternoon heat. At 38, and still unmarried, Patricia made no secret of her admiration for the young man, though he seemed oblivious to her attentions. "Just doing my job, Miss Henley," Geoffrey replied, though Miss Marple caught the slight tension in his voice. The easy smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he kept glancing toward the path Mrs. Blackwood had taken. Dr. Pemberton approached the group, his medical bag in hand, despite the social nature of the occasion. "Anything I can do? No injuries, I hope." "Only to Duchess's dignity," Mrs. Pantry assured him, though she continued to fuss over her pet. "Though perhaps you could check her over, Doctor, just to be safe," as the physician knelt to examine the cat. Miss Marple observed the way his hands trembled slightly, not the tremor of age. For he was barely 50, but something else entirely. She had noticed him drinking rather heavily at the punch bowl earlier, though he had been careful to disguise it as mere sociability. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink lower in the sky, casting longer shadows beneath the magnolia tree. The party would continue for another hour or so, Miss Marple estimated, for the guests would begin their leisurely drift back to their respective homes for supper. It was the sort of peaceful, predictable village event that she had attended dozens of times over the years, which made what happened next all the more shocking. The scream came from the direction of the Churka woman's voice, high and desperate, cutting through the gentle afternoon air like a blade. Every conversation stopped instantly, every face turning toward the sound with expressions of alarm and confusion. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Colonel Hartwell, his military bearing immediately asserting itself. That came from the churchyard. Without hesitation, he strode toward the church, followed quickly by Dr. Pemberton and several of the other men. Miss Marple rose more slowly from her chair, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way across the lawn with the measured pace of someone who had learned that rushing toward trouble rarely improved one's ability to observe it clearly. The screaming had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that seemed to press down on the village green like a heavy blanket. As she approached the low stone wall that separated the garden party from the churchyard, Miss Marple could see a small crowd gathering near the ancient yew tree that marked the oldest section of the cemetery. "Oh, my dear God," she heard Dr. Pemberton say, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Someone call the police immediately." Miss Marple quickened her pace just slightly, her mind already beginning to catalog the details that others might overlook in their shock and horror. In her experience, the moments immediately following a tragedy were when the most revealing truths came to light before people had time to construct their careful facades and rehearse their explanations. As she reached the stone wall and peered over it into the churchyard, Miss Marple saw what had caused such distress. Beneath the spreading branches of the ancient yew tree, a figure lay motionless on the moss-covered ground, surrounded by the scattered petals of magnolia, blossoms that the afternoon breeze had carried from the garden party. Mrs. Celia Blackwood would not be returning home for supper that evening. Chapter 2. Whispers and Theories. The silence that followed Dr. Pemberton's grim pronouncement seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the soft rustle of magnolia petals drifting on the evening breeze. Miss Marple remained at the stone wall, keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her, while the other guests clustered in shocked groups, their genteel afternoon shattered by the reality of death. Inspector Lewis arrived within 20 minutes, his motorcar crunching on the gravel drive of Rosemount's house with an urgency that seemed almost indecent after the day's leisurely pace. He was a competent man in his 40s, Miss Marple knew, though perhaps too eager to reach conclusions that fit tidily into his reports. "Nobody touched anything," the inspector commanded as he strode into the churchyard, his sergeant trailing behind with the notebook already in hand. "Dr. Pemberton, what can you tell me?" The physician wiped his hands on his handkerchief before responding, and Miss Marple noticed how his fingers still trembled slightly. "She's been dead, perhaps 30 minutes, Inspector. There's a severe blow to the back of her head. Quite deliberate, I'd say. Not an accident. Murder, then." Inspector Lewis surveyed the gathered crowd with a sort of calculating look that made guilty consciences squirm. "I'll need to speak with each of you individually. Nobody leaves until I've taken your statements." Mrs. Bantry fluttered her hands nervously. "But surely, Inspector, none of us would have. We were all at the garden party together. Mrs. Blackwood only left us a short while ago." "That's precisely why I need to speak with you all," the inspector replied curtly. "Someone here may have been the last to see her alive." Miss Marple watched as the guests began to separate into smaller groups, their earlier conviviality replaced by the careful maneuvering of people suddenly aware they were potential suspects. The change in atmosphere was remarkable. Where 20 minutes ago there had been lazy conversation and gentle laughter, now there were whispered conferences and meaningful glances. "Terrible business," Colonel Hartwell muttered, positioning himself near Miss Marple's elbow. "Can't imagine who would want to hurt poor Mrs. Blackwood. Bit of a dragon, perhaps, but hardly deserving of ... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with stating the obvious. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically while mentally noting that the colonel's first instinct had been to acknowledge that the victim had made enemies an interesting starting point for any investigation. She did have very strong opinions about moral conduct. Miss Marple observed mildly, "Some people find that ... challenging." Across the lawn, she could see Jeffrey Sterling speaking earnestly with Inspector Lewis, his hands gesturing as he explained something. The young man's face was pale, and he kept glancing toward the churchyard where Mrs. Blackwood's body lay beneath a police blanket. Patricia Henley hurried past him, her usual composure cracked. "I should never have encouraged her," she was muttering to herself. "I should have minded my own business." "What was that about?" Colonel Hartwell asked. But Miss Marple was already watching the next little drama unfold. The Reverend Ashworth had emerged from the church, his face grave as he approached Inspector Lewis. His wife, Violet, stood in the doorway behind him, her hands pressed to her mouth as if to prevent herself from speaking. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see the woman was trembling. "Inspector," the vicar said in his carefully modulated voice, "I understand you'll want to speak with me about Mrs. Blackwood. She was very active in church affairs." "Indeed she was," Inspector Lewis replied, making a note. "I believe she served on several committees. The Moral Guidance Committee, the Church Restoration Fund, the Ladies' Auxiliary, ... Reverend Ashworth's list seemed to grow heavier with each item. She was very thorough in her duties. Miss Marple found this exchange fascinating. In her experience, when people spoke of the dead in such carefully neutral terms, there were usually strong feelings being suppressed. She made her way closer to the conversation, settling onto a nearby bench with her knitting. "Did Mrs. Blackwood have any particular concerns recently?" the inspector continued. "Any disputes or disagreements that you're aware of?" The vicar's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Miss Marple caught it. She was concerned about certain moral lapses in the community. She felt it was her Christian duty to address them. "What sort of moral lapses?" "Oh, the usual village gossip, Inspector. Nothing that would lead to..." Again, the vicar seemed unable to finish his sentence. Dr. Pemberton had been standing quietly nearby, but now he stepped forward. "Inspector, if I might suggest, Mrs. Blackwood was known to be rather interfering in other people's affairs. She made it her business to know everyone's secrets." Inspector Lewis's ears pricked up with professional interest. "It's village life, you know," Dr. Pemberton said with a wave of his hand that struck Miss Marple as dismissive. People always imagine their neighbors are up to something scandalous. Mrs. Blackwood rather enjoyed being the repository of such information. Marple noticed that this characterization made several people uncomfortable. Jeffrey Sterling had stopped his conversation with the sergeant and was listening intently, while Patricia Henley had gone quite white around the mouth. Mrs. Bantry approached the group with tea. Trust her to think of refreshments, even in a crisis. "I brought some for everyone," she announced. Such a shock, this whole business. Poor Mrs. Blackwood, though, I must say, she did have a talent for making people uncomfortable with her questions. Inspector Lewis seized on this immediately. "Oh, you know how it is," Mrs. Bantry said, then seemed to realize she might be saying too much. She was very thorough in her inquiries about people's personal lives for the good of the community. She always said. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea gratefully and used the opportunity to observe the reactions around her. Dr. Pemberton's hand shook slightly as he lifted his cup. Jeffrey Sterling had moved away from the group entirely and was staring at the ground near the yew tree. Violet Ashworth still hadn't moved from the church doorway, though her husband kept glancing toward her with an expression that might have been worry or warning. "I suppose," Miss Marple said gently to the inspector, "you'll want to know about that last conversation she had with young Jeffrey before she left the party." The effect was immediate and telling. Jeffrey's head snapped up, his face flushing red. Dr. Pemberton set down his teacup with a sharp clink. Even Reverend Ashworth seemed to stiffen. "What conversation?" Inspector Lewis asked sharply. "It may not have been important," Miss Marple continued in her mild way, "but they seemed to be having quite an intense discussion near the fountain. Rather heated, I thought, though I couldn't hear what it was about from where I was sitting." Jeffrey Sterling stepped forward, his jaw set determinedly. "Mrs. Blackwood was. She was accusing me of something I didn't do. I told her she was wrong, but she wouldn't listen. She said she had proof." "Proof of what?" the inspector demanded. The young man looked around at the circle of faces, all watching him with varying degrees of suspicion and sympathy. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She said she knew about the money. She said she was going to tell everyone the truth about what I've done." The words hung in the air like smoke, and Miss Marple saw the exact moment when Inspector Lewis decided he had found his prime suspect. The case, in the inspector's mind, was already half solved, but Miss Marple, watching the interplay of expressions around the circle, suspected that the truth would prove far more complicated than a simple case of blackmail and murder. In her experience, when someone confessed so readily to a motive, it usually meant the real secret lay elsewhere entirely. Chapter 3. The weight of secrets. The interview room at the village police station was cramped and stuffy. It's furnished with little more than a scarred wooden table and 2 mismatched chairs. Inspector Lewis had commandeered the space for his questioning, and the parade of witnesses had been filing through for the better part of 2 hours. Miss Marple, having given her own brief statement, had positioned herself on a bench in the corridor where she could observe the comings and goings with the appearance of someone simply waiting for her turn to leave. Jeffrey Sterling emerged from his second interview, looking considerably worse than when he'd gone in. His dark hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and there was a haunted quality to his eyes that hadn't been there at the garden party. He paused in the corridor, seeming uncertain of where to go or what to do next. "Difficult questions, I imagine," Miss Marple said gently, patting the bench beside her. "Such a strain, all of this." The young man looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten there were still people in the world capable of kindness. After a moment's hesitation, he sank down beside her with the heavy sigh of someone carrying an enormous burden. "They think I killed her," he said quietly. "The inspector, as good as told me so, says I had motive and opportunity, and that my story doesn't add up." "And what is your story, dear?" Miss Marple asked, her fingers working steadily at her knitting. She had found that people often spoke more freely when her attention appeared to be elsewhere. Jeffrey was silent for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was money missing from the church restoration fund. Not a great deal, £50, but Mrs. Blackwood was the treasurer, and she noticed it immediately. She accused me of taking it because I had access to the collection box when I did my groundskeeping work. And did you take it? No. The answer came without hesitation, but Miss Marple noticed how his hands clenched in his lap. But I couldn't prove I didn't, and she said she had evidence that would ruin me. She was going to tell everyone at the parish meeting tomorrow night. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. £50 is a considerable sum for a young man in your position. What did she claim as evidence? She wouldn't say exactly, just that she'd been watching me, and she knew things about my personal life that would make everyone believe I was capable of theft. Before Miss Marple could respond, the door to the interview room opened and Patricia Henley emerged, her face blotchy with tears. The librarian hurried past them without acknowledgement, clutching her handbag as if it contained the crown jewels. Miss Henley seems quite distressed, Miss Marple observed. Jeffrey's expression darkened. She's the one who told Mrs. Blackwood about the money in the first place. Patricia counts the collection every Sunday after service, and she noticed the shortfall. Instead of coming to me or the vicar, she went straight to Mrs. Blackwood with her suspicions. How unfortunate. Though I suppose she felt it was her duty. Her duty. Jeffrey's voice rose slightly. Then he caught himself and glanced around the corridor nervously. Patricia Henley has been making my life miserable for months. She's convinced herself that we have some sort of understanding. When I tried to explain that I wasn't interested in her that way, she became vindictive. This was interesting. Miss Marple had observed Patricia's obvious infatuation with the young groundskeeper, but she hadn't realized how one-sided the attachment was. A woman scorned could indeed be dangerous, particularly one with access to information that could destroy the object of her unrequited affection. Dr. Pemberton, Inspector Lewis's voice carried from the interview room, summoning the next witness. The physician rose from a chair near the entrance, straightening his jacket with hands that Miss Marple noticed were steadier now than they had been at the garden party. Strange how crisis affects people differently, she murmured, more to herself than to Jeffrey. Some people fall apart under pressure, while others seem to find their equilibrium. The young man followed her gaze to the doctor's retreating figure. Dr. Pemberton's been acting odd lately, drinking more than usual, and he's been asking strange questions around the village. What sort of questions? About people's medical histories, their families. Things that aren't really his business unless they're his. Patients. Mrs. Blackwood mentioned it to me a few weeks ago, said she was keeping an eye on him because she suspected he was up to something unethical. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. A doctor with secrets was often a dangerous combination, particularly if those secrets involved his professional conduct. She was about to probe further when Violet Ashworth appeared at the far end of the corridor, moving with the careful steps of someone barely holding themselves together. The vicar's wife looked around nervously, then approached Miss Marple and Jeffrey with obvious reluctance. "Excuse me," she said in a voice that shook slightly, "but I wondered if, that is, did either of you see Timothy, my husband, leave the garden party at any point this afternoon?" Jeffrey looked confused. "Leave? But he was there the whole time, wasn't he? I saw him talking with Dr. Pemberton by the fountain." "Yes, but afterward," Violet pressed, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warm evening. "After their conversation ended, did you see where he went?" Miss Marple studied the woman carefully. Violet Ashworth was clearly terrified. But of what? That her husband might be involved in Mrs. Blackwood's death, or that his absence might be discovered. "I'm afraid I wasn't paying close attention to everyone's movements," Miss Marple said gently. "There was so much activity with poor Duchess getting stuck in the tree. Is there some particular reason you need to know? Violet's eyes darted between them, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she might confide in them. But then footsteps echoed in the corridor, and Reverend Ashworth himself appeared, his face grave, but composed. "Violet, there you are. Inspector Lewis would like to speak with you now." His tone was calm, but Miss Marple caught the warning look he gave his wife. "I'm sure you'll be able to clear up any confusion about this afternoon's events." As the couple walked toward the interview room, Miss Marple heard Violet whisper urgently, "Timothy, I can't what if he asks about. Just tell the truth." "My dear," the vicar replied, though his voice carried more command than comfort. "The simple truth is always best." But Miss Marple, with her long experience of human nature, knew that the truth was rarely simple, particularly when it came to matters of the heart and conscience. Each person she had observed today was carrying some burden of guilt or fear, and Mrs. Blackwood's death had done nothing but make those burdens heavier. Geoffrey stirred beside her. "I should go," he said, rising from the bench. "Inspector Lewis said I shouldn't leave the village, but I suppose I can at least go home and try to think of some way to prove my innocence." "Before you go," Miss Marple said carefully, "there's something I've been wondering about. When Mrs. Blackwood spoke to you about the missing money, did she seem frightened at all? Or just angry?" The young man considered this. "Now that you mention it, she did seem nervous. Kept looking around, as if she expected someone to overhear us. And she said something odd, that she wasn't the only one who knew about the money, and that I'd better be careful who I trusted." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Another piece of the puzzle, though where it fit remained to be seen. As Geoffrey walked away, she reflected on everything she had learned so far. Money was missing from the church fund. But Mrs. Blackwood apparently wasn't the only one who knew about it. Dr. Pemberton was acting strangely and asking inappropriate questions. Patricia Henley had been spurned and had turned vindictive. The vicar and his wife were hiding something that terrified Violet, and Geoffrey Sterling, despite his apparent confession of motive, might well be telling the truth about his innocence. In Miss Marple's experience, when there were this many secrets swirling around a single death, the real murderer was usually the person whose secret was the most dangerous and the most carefully hidden. Chapter 4. Shadows in the vestry. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was mourning the loss of little Phoenix Peace. Miss Marple made her way to the village church for the early service, her umbrella providing scant protection against the persistent mist. She had always found that churches revealed their secrets more readily in the quiet hours before the congregation arrived, when the building held only echoes and whispered prayers. The heavy oak door creaked as she pushed it open, and she was surprised to find she was not alone. Dr. Pemberton knelt in the front pew, his head bowed in what appeared to be fervent prayer. His shoulders shook slightly, and Miss Marple wondered if it was from cold emotion or something else entirely. She settled herself in a pew near the back, ostensibly to pray, but actually to observe. The doctor's vigil continued for several minutes before he seemed to sense her presence. When he turned, his face was haggard, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice hoarse, "I didn't expect to see anyone else here so early. I find morning prayer particularly comforting in times of trouble." She replied gently, "Are you quite well, doctor? You look rather peaked." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Physician, heal thyself. Isn't that what they say? I'm afraid I've been rather poor at following my own advice lately." Before Miss Marple could respond, the vestry door opened and Reverend Ashworth emerged, carrying a stack of prayer books. He stopped short when he saw them, and she noticed how his knuckles whitened as he gripped the books more tightly. "Kara Pemberton," the vicar said carefully, "I thought you might be here. Inspector Lewis was asking about you last night after you left the station." "Was he indeed?" The doctor's tone was deliberately casual, but Miss Marple caught the tension beneath it. I suppose he has questions for all of us. Taps. Though I gather he's particularly interested in your professional relationship with Mrs. Blackwood. The words hung in the air like incense, heavy with unspoken meaning. Dr. Pemberton's face went pale, and Miss Marple saw his hands begin to tremble again. It's my professional relationship, he repeated slowly. She consulted you about her health concerns, didn't she? Quite recently, I believe. Miss Marple watched this exchange with growing interest. The vicar's questions seemed oddly pointed for casual conversation, almost as if he were deliberately probing for information. She noticed that his own hands were shaking slightly as he set down the prayer books. Many people consult me about their health, Dr. Pemberton said stiffly. Patient confidentiality prevents me from discussing such matters, even with the police, especially with the police, unless legally compelled. Reverend Ashworth nodded slowly. Of course, though I suppose if Mrs. Blackwood had discovered something irregular about her treatment, that might change things. The doctor stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. What exactly are you implying, Reverend? Nothing at all. I'm simply trying to understand why a woman who appeared to be in good health would suddenly be so concerned about her medical records. Miss Marple found this revelation fascinating. Mrs. Blackwood had been inquiring about her medical records. For someone who had seemed perfectly healthy, that was indeed curious behavior. She was a hypochondriac, Dr. Pemberton said dismissively, but his voice lacked conviction, always imagining ailments that didn't exist. Yet, you continued to treat her. It's my job to treat patients, regardless of whether their concerns are justified. The two men faced each other across the nave, and Miss Marple could feel the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Whatever had passed between them went far deeper than professional disagreement. The church door opened again, admitting a gust of damp air and Patricia Henley. The librarian looked around nervously, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. When she saw the three of them, she hesitated, as if considering retreat. Miss Henley, Reverend Ashworth called out, his voice carefully modulated back to its usual pastoral tone. Please, come in. We were just discussing yesterday's tragic events. Patricia approached slowly, clutching her handbag. I couldn't sleep, she said simply. I kept thinking about what I'd done, what I'd said to her. If I hadn't told her about the money, ... You did what you thought was right, the vicar assured her, though Miss Marple noticed he avoided meeting her eyes. Mrs. Blackwood was the treasurer. She had a right to know, but I could have spoken to you first, Patricia said, her voice breaking. Or to Geoffrey directly. Instead, I went to her because I was angry with him. Dr. Pemberton moved toward the door. I should be going. Patients to see. Doctor, Miss Marple said quietly. I wonder if you might spare a moment. I've been having some concerns about my heart medication. He paused, clearly wanting to refuse, but unable to do so without appearing churlish. Of course. Perhaps we could step outside. They left the church together, but instead of discussing medication, Miss Marple led him to a bench near the cemetery where they could speak privately. You seem very troubled, Doctor, she said, once they were seated. More troubled than one might expect from simply losing a patient. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't my patient, he replied quickly. She hadn't consulted me in months. Yet, Reverend Ashworth seemed to think she'd been asking about her medical records recently. Dr. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment, staring at the headstones that surrounded them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. She came to me 3 weeks ago, not as a patient, but as someone who claimed to have discovered something about my practice, something that could destroy my reputation. What sort of something? She said she'd been talking to former patients, people who had moved away from the village. She claimed there were discrepancies in their treatment, medications that had been prescribed but never delivered. pain relief that had been documented but never administered. Miss Marple felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning mist. And was there truth to her claims? He stopped, his face crumpling. I've been struggling, Miss Marple. My wife's illness before she died. The bills, the treatments that weren't covered by insurance. I thought I could replace what I'd taken before anyone noticed. Just small amounts, nothing that would truly harm anyone. But Mrs. Blackwood noticed. She had a talent for noticing things. She said she'd been watching me for months, documenting everything. She had dates, times, names of patients. She was going to report me to the medical board unless I helped her with something. She said she needed medical evidence for a personal matter. Documentation that would prove someone was lying about their health. She wanted me to fabricate records. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So Mrs. Blackwood had been blackmailing the doctor. But for what purpose? What personal matter could have required falsified medical records? Did you agree to help her? I told her I needed time to think about it. She gave me until yesterday evening to decide. Said if I didn't agree, she'd have no choice but to expose me. And yesterday evening, she was dead. Dr. Pemberton turned to look at her, his eyes wide with something that might have been relief or terror. Yes, yesterday evening, she was dead. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the drizzle create small puddles on the cemetery paths. Miss Marple was processing this new information when she noticed something odd. Near the yew tree where Mrs. Blackwood's body had been found, someone had left a small bouquet of flowers, not the usual funeral arrangement, but a simple bunch of daisies tied with a yellow ribbon. Doctor, she said casually, did you happen to notice if anyone else left the garden party yesterday afternoon? Besides Mrs. Blackwood, I mean. He considered this. I was rather preoccupied with my own concerns. But I think I saw Reverend Ashworth walking toward the church around the same time Mrs. Blackwood left, and Patricia Henley disappeared for a while, said she was going to the library to fetch something. More pieces of the puzzle, Miss Marple thought. The vicar who had questioned the doctor so pointedly this morning, Ken the librarian whose unrequited love had turned to vindictive anger. Either of them could have had opportunity, and she was beginning to suspect that Mrs. Blackwood's web of blackmail and interference, had ensnared more than just the doctor. The question was, which of her victims had finally decided that death was preferable to continued torment? Chapter 5. The library's silent witness. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning in quiet contemplation. But by afternoon, her restless mind demanded action. The village library seemed a natural destination. Not only had Patricia Henley claimed to have visited it during the crucial time period, but libraries, in Miss Marple's experience, were repositories of more than just books. They held the quiet confidences of regular patrons and the observant insights of librarians who watched the ebb and flow of village life. The Little Fenwick Library occupied a converted Victorian house on the High Street, its rooms still retaining the intimate feeling of a family home. Miss Marple found Patricia at the circulation desk, mechanically stamping returned books with the sort of determined focus that suggested she was trying very hard not to think about other things. Good afternoon, dear, Miss Marple said gently. I wonder if you might help me find something to read. Something soothing, perhaps. Yesterday's events have left me rather unsettled. Patricia looked up with eyes that were still puffy from crying. Of course, Miss Marple. Were you thinking of something in particular? Poetry, perhaps. Or maybe a nice historical romance. Actually, I was hoping you might recommend something from your recent acquisitions. I understand you had to leave yesterday's party to collect some new books. The stamp slipped in Patricia's hand, leaving a crooked mark across the due date card. Oh, that. Yes. Well, I had promised Mrs. Bantry I would bring some books for her house guests, and I'd forgotten them. Such a silly thing to worry about, really, given what happened afterward. Of course, though I imagine it must have been difficult leaving such a lovely party. The timing was unfortunate. Tricia's hands stilled completely. Timing. Well, you must have been here when it happened. How dreadful for you to miss all the commotion and then return to find Miss Marple. Let her voice trail off sympathetically. I wasn't here long, Patricia said quickly. Just long enough to gather the books Mrs. Bantry wanted. 10 minutes at most. Miss Marple nodded, but she was thinking that 10 minutes was quite sufficient time for someone to walk from the library to the churchyard, commit murder, and return. The timing would have been tight, but not impossible. I don't suppose you saw anyone else about during your visit. The streets were probably quite empty, with everyone at the party. No one. Well, Patricia hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Actually, I did see someone, but I'm not sure I should say. Inspector Lewis didn't seem particularly interested when I mentioned it. Oh, it was Violet Ashworth. She was coming out of Dr. Pemberton's surgery, looking quite distressed. I called out to her, but she didn't seem to hear me. She hurried off toward the church. Miss Marple felt a little thrill of discovery. Violet Ashworth at the doctor's surgery during the time of the murder. That was certainly interesting, particularly given her obvious fear the previous evening. How strange that she would need medical attention during a social event, Miss Marple mused. Did she appear to be ill? Not ill, exactly. More ... frightened, as if she'd received bad news. Patricia leaned forward conspiratorially. There have been rumors, about the vicar's wife. Some people think she's been, acting strangely lately. In what way? Secretive? Nervous? Mrs. Blackwood mentioned to me last week that she suspected Violet was hiding something significant. Something that could cause a scandal for the church. Another thread in Mrs. Blackwood's web of secrets and suspicions. Miss Marple filed this information away while maintaining her expression of mild interest. Mrs. Blackwood did seem to take a great interest in everyone's affairs, she observed. Too much interest, if you ask me. Patricia's voice turned bitter. She made it her business to know things that weren't her concern. Private things. Did she know private things about you, dear? The question was asked so gently that Patricia seemed to answer before she thought better of it. She knew about my feelings for Geoffrey. She said it was unseemly for a woman my age to harbor such thoughts about a younger man. She threatened to tell people to make me a laughingstock. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. How cruel of her. Though I imagine your feelings were quite obvious to anyone who cared to look. Was I that transparent? Patricia's voice was small, embarrassed. Love often is, dear. But there's no shame in it. Did Mrs. Blackwood say anything else about Geoffrey? She ... Patricia glanced around the empty library, then lowered her voice. She said she knew he was stealing from the church, but that wasn't the worst of his crimes. She hinted that there were other things, darker things. She said I was a fool to waste my affections on someone so thoroughly corrupt. Did you believe her? Patricia was quiet for a long moment, absently straightening the already neat stacks of books. I wanted to. It would have made it easier to stop caring about him. But Geoffrey's not a bad person, Miss Marple. Weak, perhaps, and foolish with money, but not evil. Mrs. Blackwood had a talent for making even innocent actions seem sinister. The library door chimed, and Colonel Hartwell entered, shaking raindrops from his umbrella. He nodded politely to Miss Marple before approaching the desk. Miss Henley, I wonder if you could help me locate a particular book. Something about military strategy during the Great War. My nephew is visiting next week, and he's expressed interest in the subject. Of course, Colonel. Let me check our catalog. As Patricia busied herself with the card index, Colonel Hartwell moved closer to Miss Marple. Terrible business, this murder, he said quietly. I've been giving it considerable thought, and I have a theory. Oh, it's the timing that's significant, you see. Mrs. Blackwood was killed during the garden party, when everyone's attention was elsewhere. That suggests careful planning, military precision. Not a crime of passion, but a calculated execution. Miss Marple found his choice of words interesting. You think it was premeditated? Absolutely. And that rules out young Sterling, in my opinion. If he'd killed her in anger after their argument, he would have done it then and there. This delayed action suggests someone with more self-control, more tactical thinking. Who do you suspect? Colonel Hartwell glanced around, then leaned closer. I hate to say it, but I think we need to look at people with medical knowledge. Someone who would know exactly how to strike to ensure death, but also how to make it appear like a simple blow to the head. Dr. Pemberton. It pains me to say it, but yes. I've known Marcus for years, and lately he's been ... different. Drinking heavily, nervous about something, and he certainly had the opportunity yesterday. Patricia returned with a slim volume on military tactics. Here you are, Colonel. I'm afraid our selection is rather limited. This will do nicely, thank you. He accepted the book, then turned back to Miss Marple. I suppose we'll know more when Inspector Lewis completes his investigation. Though between you and me, I'm not entirely confident in his abilities. He seems rather too eager to settle on the obvious suspect. After the colonel left, Miss Marple remained at the circulation desk, ostensibly browsing through the returned books, but actually thinking about everything she had learned. Patricia's account of seeing Violet Ashworth at the doctor's surgery was particularly intriguing, as was the suggestion that Mrs. Blackwood had suspected the vicar's wife of hiding a scandal. Miss Henley, she said, eventually, I wonder if you keep records of who visits the library and when. For security purposes, perhaps. We have a sign-in book, Patricia replied, producing a leather-bound ledger. Though people don't always remember to use it. Miss Marple examined the entries for the previous day. Patricia's own name appeared at 3:15 p.m., with a departure time of 3:25 p.m. But more interesting was an earlier entry, V. Ashworth, 2:45 p.m., with no departure time noted. It appears Mrs. Ashworth was here before you arrived, Miss Marple observed. Patricia looked at the entry with surprise. I didn't see her when I came in. She must have left by the back door. It opens directly onto the alley behind the church. The back door that opened onto the alley behind the church. Miss Marple felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Violet Ashworth had been at the library, then at the doctor's surgery, and finally had access to the churchyard through the back alley. The timing would have been perfect for someone who knew the village's hidden pathways. But what could the vicar's wife have been doing at the library that required such secrecy? And what had Dr. Pemberton told her that left her looking so frightened? Miss Marple had the distinct feeling that the next conversation she needed to have was with Violet Ashworth herself. Chapter 6. The vicar's wife. The vicarage sat behind the church like a faithful shadow. Its ivy-covered walls and leaded windows, speaking of quiet respectability and modest comfort. Miss Marple approached it through the garden, where late roses struggled against the persistent drizzle that had marked the day. She could see a figure moving behind the kitchen window. Violet Ashworth, washing dishes with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere entirely. Miss Marple knocked gently on the back door, knowing that the formal front entrance would put the already nervous woman further on edge. When Violet opened the door, her face showed no surprise, only a wary resignation that suggested she had been expecting this visit. Miss Marple, she said quietly, please, come in. I've just made tea. The kitchen was warm and tidy, with a sort of careful order that spoke of a woman who found comfort in routine. Violet moved about, preparing the tea service with steady hands. But Miss Marple noticed how she avoided meeting her eyes. Such a difficult time for everyone, Miss Marple said gently, settling into a chair at the scrubbed wooden table. I imagine it's particularly hard for you and your husband, being so involved in the community. Yes, Violet replied simply, setting out the cups with unnecessary precision. Timothy has been. The whole situation has been very trying for him, and for you as well, I'm sure. Mrs. Blackwood was quite active in church affairs. Violet's hand trembled slightly as she poured the tea. She was very dedicated to what she saw as her duties. Miss Marple accepted her cup gratefully, noting how the simple act of serving tea seemed to calm the younger woman slightly. I understand you had some dealings with her recently. Patricia Henley mentioned seeing you yesterday afternoon, looking rather upset. The effect was immediate. Violet set down the teapot with a sharp clink, her face going pale. Patricia saw me, coming from Dr. Pemberton's surgery. She was concerned about you, said. You appeared distressed. For a moment, Miss Marple thought Violet might deny it entirely. But then the woman's shoulders sagged, and she sank into the chair across from her visitor. I suppose there's no point in trying to hide it anymore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Blackwood had discovered something about me, something I thought no one would ever know. Would you like to tell me about it, dear? Violet was quiet for so long that Miss Marple began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, the words came out in a rush, as if she were afraid she might lose courage if she stopped. 5 years ago, before Timothy and I came to Little Fenwick, I was very ill. Not physically, mentally. I had what the doctors called a nervous breakdown. I spent several months in a private sanatorium, recovering from what they termed acute melancholia. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly, understanding now why the woman had been so frightened. Timothy was wonderful about it, Violet continued. He never made me feel ashamed, never treated me as if I were fragile or broken. When the position here became available, we agreed that my illness would remain private. The church authorities knew I had been unwell, but not the specifics. But Mrs. Blackwood discovered the truth. She had a talent for digging up information. She contacted the sanatorium directly, claiming to be conducting a character reference for some position I was supposedly applying for. The administrator, thinking it was legitimate, confirmed my stay there. Miss Marple felt a surge of indignation at Mrs. Blackwood's deceptive methods, but she kept her expression neutral. What did she want from you? At first, just information about other people in the village. She seemed to think that my condition made me more observant of human weakness. She wanted me to report back to her about conversations I'd heard, things I'd noticed about parishioners' private lives. But that wasn't all. Violet shook her head miserably. Last week, she made a more specific demand. She wanted me to search Timothy's study for correspondence with the bishop about the church restoration fund. She suspected there were irregularities in how the money was being handled. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. And we're there. I don't know. I couldn't bring myself to spy on my own husband. When I told her I wouldn't do it, she threatened to tell the entire parish about my illness. She said she would make it sound far worse than it was, that she would claim I was still unstable and dangerous. So you went to Dr. Pemberton for help? I thought perhaps he could provide some sort of medical documentation that would counter her claims. But when I arrived at his surgery yesterday, he was in such a state. He could barely focus on what I was saying. He kept muttering about being ruined, about his reputation being destroyed. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Did he tell you why? Not directly, but it was clear that Mrs. Blackwood had something on him as well. When I explained my situation, he laughed bitterly and said we were both victims of the same predator. He said she was systematically destroying anyone who wouldn't bow to her demands. What happened then? He gave me something, a mild sedative. Said it would help with my nerves. But he also said something strange. He told me that Mrs. Blackwood's power over people came from their shame about their secrets, okay? And that sometimes the only way to stop a blackmailer was to remove their ability to talk. Miss Marple felt a chill at these words. And after you left the surgery, I went to the library. I thought perhaps I could find some book about nervous conditions, something that would help me understand how to explain my illness in a way that wouldn't sound frightening. But Patricia wasn't there when I arrived. I couldn't concentrate on reading. I kept thinking about what Dr. Pemberton had said about stopping blackmailers. Did you go anywhere else? Violet's eyes filled with tears. I walked through the churchyard. I often do when I'm upset. It's peaceful there, and it helps me think. I saw Mrs. Blackwood's handbag lying near the yew tree, but I didn't see her at first. I called out, thinking she might have dropped it accidentally, and then I saw her, lying so still under the tree, with magnolia petals scattered around her like snow. I knew immediately that she was dead, and my first thought was ... She stopped, her face crumpling with shame. What was your first thought, dear? I was relieved, Violet whispered. God forgive me, but I was relieved that she couldn't hurt me anymore. I stood there for several minutes, just staring at her, and all I could think was that finally, I was free. Miss Marple reached across the table and patted the younger woman's hand, gently. And then I heard voices from the garden party, and I realized that someone would come looking for her soon. I picked up her handbag. Don't know why. Perhaps to see if there was anything in it that could hurt other people, and I ran back to the vicarage through the alley. What did you find in the handbag? Violet rose and walked to a kitchen drawer, withdrawing a black leather handbag with shaking hands. I haven't had the courage to look through it properly, but ... double quotes. She opened it and showed Miss Marple the contents. A notebook filled with names and dates. Several letters in different handwritings. In a small bundle of photographs, Miss Marple examined the notebook briefly. It was indeed a catalog of secrets notes about Jeffrey's financial troubles, Dr. Pemberton's theft, Patricia's unrequited love, and dozens of other observations about village residents. The letters appeared to be correspondence from people Mrs. Blackwood had contacted for information. And the photographs. These are quite old, Miss Marple observed, studying the sepia-toned images. They appear to be from the 1920s. I noticed that too. I can't imagine why she would have kept such old photographs, or what they could have to do with anyone in Little Fenwick today. Miss Marple studied the faces in the photographs more carefully. There was something familiar about one of them, a young woman with distinctive features that reminded her of someone she knew. But before she could place the resemblance, footsteps sounded on the garden path outside. That will be Timothy returning from his hospital visits, Violet said quickly, closing the handbag and replacing it in the drawer. Please, Miss Marple, you won't tell him about what I've told you. Of course not, dear. But Violet, realize you'll have to tell Inspector Lewis about finding the body first. I know. I've been trying to work up the courage all day. I was afraid he wouldn't believe that I didn't kill her myself. The back door opened, and Reverend Ashworth entered, his clerical collar wilted from the damp day. He greeted Miss Marple politely, but with obvious wariness, and she could see him taking in the scene, his wife's red-rimmed eyes, the hastily composed expressions, the tension that seemed to fill the warm kitchen like smoke. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, he said carefully. Having a chat over tea, Miss Marple replied brightly. Your wife has been such good company on this dreary day. But as she made her polite farewells and walked back through the garden, Miss Marple's mind was racing. Violet's story explained much her movements, her obvious fear, her husband's protective behavior. But it also raised new questions. If Violet had found Mrs. Blackwood already dead, who had killed her? And what secrets were hidden in those old photographs that Mrs. Blackwood had carried with her to her death? Chapter 7. Echoes from the Past. Miss Marple spent the evening in her sitting room, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked through the tangle of information she had gathered. The old photographs from Mrs. Blackwood's handbag troubled her. There had been something hauntingly familiar about one of the faces, a resemblance that nagged at the edges of her memory like a half-remembered melody. Thought the next morning brought Inspector Lewis to her door, his expression grim and purposeful. She invited him in for tea, noting the way his eyes immediately swept the room as if searching for evidence of some unknown crime. Miss Marple, he began without preamble. "I understand you've been conducting your own inquiries into Mrs. Blackwood's death." "Oh my," she said mildly, pouring tea with steady hands. "I wouldn't call them inquiries, Inspector. Simply conversations with concerned neighbors. It's conversations that have yielded information you haven't shared with the police." Marple considered this carefully. "I wasn't aware I possessed any information that would be helpful to your investigation. Have I overlooked something important?" Inspector Lewis accepted the teacup with barely concealed impatience. "Mrs. Ashworth has confessed to tampering with evidence. She claims she found Mrs. Blackwood's handbag at the scene and removed it before reporting the body." How troubling for her. Such a difficult position to be in. "She also claims that you advised her to come forward with this information." "I merely suggested that honesty is generally the best policy, particularly in matters involving the police." The inspector leaned forward. "Miss Marple, I need to know exactly what Mrs. Ashworth told you and what you saw in that handbag." Miss Marple set down her knitting and gave him her full attention. "Very well, Inspector. Mrs. Ashworth discovered the body before anyone else, became frightened, and took the handbag hoping to protect herself and others from whatever Mrs. Blackwood might have documented about their private affairs, and the contents: a notebook containing observations about various villagers, some correspondence, and several old photographs that seemed quite out of place. Old photographs from the 1920s, I would estimate. I found them curious because they seemed to have no connection to current village residents." Inspector Lewis made notes, his pen scratching across the paper with bureaucratic efficiency. "I'll need to examine these items immediately. Mrs. Ashworth has agreed to surrender the handbag, but I want your impression of what might be significant." Miss Marple rose and fetched her own handbag, withdrawing a small piece of paper. "I took the liberty of making a note about one particular photograph. There was a young woman in it who bore a striking resemblance to someone I knew many years ago." She handed him the paper, on which she had written, "Young woman, approximately 20 years old, distinctive features, standing beside what appears to be a seaside pier. Date, likely 1923 to 1925, based on clothing and photographic style. You think you recognize her? Perhaps, though it's difficult to be certain after so many years." Marple paused, choosing her words carefully. "Inspector, have you considered that Mrs. Blackwood's interest in the past might be connected to her activities in the present?" "What do you mean?" "Blackmailers often trade in old secrets as well as new ones. Sometimes the most damaging information is that which people thought safely buried decades ago." Inspector Lewis finished his tea and stood to leave. "I appreciate your observations, Miss Marple, but I believe we're dealing with a much simpler case. Someone Mrs. Blackwood was currently blackmailing decided they'd had enough. The motive is clear, the opportunity was present, and the method was straightforward. And your prime suspect? Young Sterling remains our focus. Despite his protestations of innocence, he had the strongest motive in the most recent confrontation with the victim." After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat in contemplative silence. His certainty troubled her in her experience. The most obvious solution was rarely the correct one when human nature was involved. She found herself thinking again about those photographs, particularly the young woman whose face had seemed so familiar. A knock at her door interrupted these thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Bantry, looking unusually flustered. "Jane, dear, I hope you don't mind my calling, but I simply had to speak with someone sensible about this dreadful business." "Of course, Dolly. Come in. You look quite upset." Mrs. Bantry settled herself in the sitting room with a sort of dramatic flair that suggested important revelations. "It's about Mrs. Blackwood, and something rather disturbing I discovered this morning while cleaning out the guest room. My house guests left yesterday, understandably, given the circumstances, but they forgot a book. When I went to pack it for posting, I found it had been used as a hiding place." Mrs. Bantry opened her handbag and withdrew a slim volume of poetry, its pages yellowed with age. "Look at this, Jane." Hidden between the pages were several newspaper clippings, all dated from the mid-1920s. Miss Marple examined them carefully, her interest sharpening as she read the headlines. Local woman dies in suspicious circumstances. Coroner's inquest returns open verdict. Family disputes, suicide ruling. These are from Brighton, Miss Marple observed. Do you recognize any of the names mentioned? That's just it. I don't. Okay, but look at this photograph accompanying one of the articles. Miss Marple studied the grainy newspaper image and felt a jolt of recognition. It was the same young woman from Mrs. Blackwood's photograph, though in this context, she was identified as Miss Catherine Fairfax, aged 23, found dead at the base of Brighton's West Pier. Dolly, Miss Marple said, carefully. Where exactly did your house guests find this book? In the library at Rosemount. They said it was tucked behind some other volumes on the poetry shelf, as if someone had hidden it there deliberately. Miss Marple felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into a new pattern. How long has that particular book been in your library? I have no idea. Most of the books came with the house when I inherited it. The previous owner, old Mr. Fairfax, was quite a collector. Fairfax. Miss Marple's pulse quickened. The same name as the young woman in the newspaper clipping. Mrs. Bantry looked at the clipping again. Why, yes. I never made that connection. How extraordinary. Did you know Mr. Fairfax well? Hardly at all. He was quite elderly when I met him, and rather reclusive. He died about 6 months before my husband inherited the property from him. Some distant family connection, apparently. Miss Marple was quiet for several minutes, her mind working through the implications. A young woman named Catherine Fairfax had died under suspicious circumstances in Brighton in the 1920s. Mrs. Blackwood had possessed a photograph of this same woman, and now newspaper clippings about her death had been found hidden in a book that belonged to someone with the same surname. Dolly, she said, finally, I don't suppose you have any documentation about your inheritance. Papers that might explain the family connection between your husband and Mr. Fairfax. Oh yes, somewhere in the solicitor's files. Though I must say, it was all rather mysterious at the time. My husband had never mentioned having any relatives named Fairfax, and we were quite surprised when the solicitor contacted us about the bequest. Could you possibly retrieve those papers? I have a feeling they might be more important than anyone realized. Mrs. Bantry agreed to search for the documents, and after she left, Miss Marple found herself staring out the window at the village green where Mrs. Blackwood had met her death beneath the magnolia tree. The past and present were connected in ways that were only beginning to become clear, and she suspected that Mrs. Blackwood's death had its roots in events that had occurred decades before any of the current suspects had even arrived in Little Fenwick. But how did a tragedy from the 1920s relate to the theft of church funds, a doctor's professional misconduct, or a librarian's unrequited love? And more importantly, who in the village had known enough about Catherine Fairfax's death to kill in order to keep that knowledge buried? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay in understanding not just what Mrs. Blackwood knew about the village's current secrets, but what she had discovered about their hidden connections to the past. Chapter 8. The Unraveling Thread. Miss Marple spent the early hours of the next morning in the churchyard, ostensibly tending to the flowers on her parents' grave, but actually studying the scene where Mrs. Blackwood had died. The yew tree cast long shadows in the pale dawn light, and she found herself wondering what had drawn the victim to this particular spot at that particular moment. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Dr. Pemberton's approach until he spoke. It's rather early for gardening, isn't it, Miss Marple? She looked up to find him standing nearby, his medical bag in hand and dark circles under his eyes, suggesting another sleepless night. I find the morning hours peaceful for reflection, she replied. Are you making house calls so early? Mrs. Henderson's baby has been colicky. 3rd time this week I've been called out before dawn. set down his bag and rubbed his face wearily. I don't suppose you've heard any news about the investigation. Inspector Lewis seems quite confident in his theory about young Jeffrey. Dr. Pemberton was quiet for a moment, then moved closer to where she knelt among the flowers. Miss Marple, there's something I need to tell someone, and I find I can't bring myself to speak to the inspector. She looked up at him with gentle encouragement. What troubles you, Doctor? It's about Mrs. Blackwood's visits to my surgery. She wasn't just interested in my professional indiscretions. He paused, struggling with the words. She'd been asking questions about old medical records, files from patients who were treated here decades ago. Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. What sort of records? She was particularly interested in death certificates from the 1920s. She claimed she was researching family history. But her questions were very specific. She wanted to know about a young woman who had supposedly died of consumption, but whose family had always suspected something more sinister. Catherine Fairfax. Dr. Pemberton's head snapped up in surprise. How did you? Yes, that was the name. How could you possibly know that? Miss Marple rose from her kneeling position, brushing dirt from her gloves. Mrs. Blackwood had materials relating to Miss Fairfax's death. What did you tell her about the medical records? That's just it, there weren't any. At least, not the ones she was looking for. The records from that period are incomplete, and what documentation exists suggests the young woman died of natural causes. But Mrs. Blackwood was convinced there had been a cover-up. Did she say why she believed that? Dr. Pemberton glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. She said she had evidence that Miss Fairfax had been pregnant when she died, and that certain people in the village had gone to great lengths to conceal that fact. She claimed the official cause of death was falsified to protect someone's reputation. Miss Marple absorbed this information carefully. A pregnant young woman, a suspicious death, and a cover-up that had lasted nearly 30 years. Did she mention who she suspected of being involved in this cover-up? She was coy about specifics, but she did say something curious. She told me that sometimes the sins of the fathers are visited upon their children, and that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Jeffrey Sterling emerged from behind the church, carrying a toolkit and looking surprised to find them there. "Excuse me," he said, awkwardly. "I didn't realize anyone would be here so early. Inspector Lewis asked me to repair the gate latch before the funeral tomorrow." "Funeral?" Miss Marple inquired. "Sis Blackwood's. Her nephew arrived yesterday to make arrangements. Apparently, she has no other living relatives." Dr. Pemberton picked up his medical bag. "I should be going. Patients to see." He paused, looking directly at Miss Marple. "What I told you about the records, I hope you'll use that information wisely." After he left, Miss Marple found herself alone with Jeffrey, who was working on the gate with the sort of concentrated effort that suggested he was trying to avoid conversation. She decided to take advantage of the opportunity. "Mr. Sterling," she said gently, "I've been wondering about something. When Mrs. Blackwood confronted you about the missing money, did she mention anything about your family history?" Jeffrey's hand stilled on the gate latch. "My family? What would that have to do with church funds? Perhaps nothing. But I've learned that Mrs. Blackwood had interests beyond current village affairs. She seemed quite fascinated by events from decades past." "I don't understand." Miss Marple moved closer, studying his face carefully. "What do you know about your parents, Jeffrey? About how they came to live in Little Fenwick?" "My parents died when I was very young. I was raised by my grandmother in the next village over. She told me my father had worked as a groundskeeper here before the war, but that's all I know." "And your grandmother never mentioned any other family connections? No relatives who might have lived in the area?" Jeffrey shook his head, but Miss Marple noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She was very private about family matters. Said the past was best left buried. The phrase sent a chill through Miss Marple. Did she ever mention the name Fairfax? The effect was immediate and dramatic. Jeffrey dropped his tool, his face going white. How? How do you know that name? So you do recognize it. Jeffrey looked around frantically, as if expecting Mrs. Blackwood herself to materialize from behind a headstone. My grandmother mentioned it once, when she was very ill near the end. She was talking about old debts and family shame. She said the Fairfax name was cursed, and that I must never speak of it to anyone. What else did she tell you? Nothing coherent. She was delirious most of the time, but she kept saying that someone had to pay for what happened to Catherine, and that the truth would come out eventually. Miss Marple felt the final pieces of the puzzle beginning to slide into place. Jeffrey, I need you to think very carefully. Did Mrs. Blackwood ever suggest that your family was connected to something that happened long ago? She, ... He stopped, his face crumpling with the weight of memory. The day she accused me of stealing, she said something about inherited guilt. She said my family owed a debt that had never been paid, and that she was going to make sure it was settled, one way or another. And you had no idea what she meant. I thought she was just being cruel, trying to hurt me, because I wouldn't confess to taking the money. But now, he looked at Miss Marple with growing horror. You think she was killed because of something that happened before I was even born? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that Mrs. Blackwood discovered something about Catherine Fairfax's death that threatened someone very much alive today. Someone who has been living with that secret for 30 years and was willing to kill to keep it buried. Jeffrey sank onto a nearby bench, his face in his hands. But who in Little Fenwick could have been involved in something that happened so long ago? Miss Marple looked around the peaceful churchyard, where the morning sun was beginning to dispel the shadows cast by the ancient yew tree. The village seemed so innocent, so removed from the violence and passion that it claimed to young women's lives, 3 decades apart. But she was beginning to understand that appearances, especially in villages like Little Fenwick, could be deeply deceiving. Someone among their quiet neighbors had carried the weight of Catherine Fairfax's death for 30 years. And when Mrs. Blackwood had threatened to expose that secret, they had chosen murder over confession. The question was no longer who had killed Mrs. Blackwood, but who among the villagers was old enough to have been involved in Catherine Fairfax's death, and desperate enough to kill again to protect that secret. As she walked home through the village streets, Miss Marple found herself studying every face with new eyes, looking for the signs of a guilt that had festered for 3 decades, before finally erupting in violence beneath the magnolia tree. Chapter 9. The test. The morning of Mrs. Blackwood's funeral dawned crisp and clear, as if the weather had finally decided to show proper respect for the dead. Miss Marple dressed carefully in her best black dress and hat, knowing that funerals often revealed more about the living than they honored the departed. In her experience, murderers frequently attended their victims' funerals, drawn by some combination of guilt, curiosity, and the need to appear above suspicion. The church was surprisingly full, though Miss Marple suspected that many attendees had come more from morbid fascination than genuine grief. She positioned herself in a pew where she could observe the congregation while appearing to focus on the service. Mrs. Blackwood's nephew, a thin, nervous man in his 40s, sat in the front row beside a woman Miss Marple didn't recognize. Behind them, the village's prominent residents had arranged themselves with the sort of careful attention to hierarchy that marked all such occasions. Colonel Hartwell sat ramrod straight in his military pairing, while Dr. Pemberton appeared pale and drawn, despite his obvious efforts to compose himself. The Ashworths, naturally, were conducting the service, though Miss Marple noticed how Violet's hands trembled as she played the organ. Geoffrey Sterling had positioned himself near the back, his face carefully neutral but his posture tense. Patricia Henley sat alone in the middle section, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, though Miss Marple doubted the tears were entirely genuine. Most interesting of all was Mrs. Bantry, who kept glancing around the church with the sort of nervous energy that suggested she had Something important to say, but wasn't sure when or how to say it. She had telephoned Miss Marple the previous evening to report that she had found the inheritance documents, but had been too agitated to discuss them properly over the phone as Reverend Ashworth delivered his carefully neutral eulogy praising Mrs. Blackwood's dedication to community service without mentioning her more intrusive tendencies. Marple found herself studying the faces around her, looking for signs of the guilt she now knew must be hidden somewhere in this congregation. Who among these seemingly ordinary villagers had been alive in the 1920s? Colonel Hartwell would have been in his 40s then, certainly old enough to have been involved in whatever had happened to Catherine Fairfax. Dr. Pemberton would have been too young, but what about his predecessor? And what of the older residents who might not be present today? The service concluded with a hymn that Mrs. Blackwood had apparently requested years earlier, and the congregation filed out into the churchyard for the interment. Miss Marple lingered, watching as small groups formed and reformed around the gravesite. It was then that she noticed something peculiar. Mrs. Bantry was speaking urgently to Colonel Hartwell, pressing what appeared to be a document into his hands. The colonel's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face went ashen, and he took a step backward as if the paper had burned him. He said something sharp to Mrs. Bantry, who shook her head emphatically and pointed toward the church. Miss Marple moved closer, using the crowd as cover. "Can't possibly expect me to," the colonel was saying. "But you must," Mrs. Bantry insisted. "Now that I know the truth, I can't simply keep your voice down," Colonel Hartwell hissed, glancing around nervously. "This is neither the time nor the place." "Then when? When will be the right time to finally tell the truth about what happened to that poor girl?" Miss Marple felt her pulse quicken. Mrs. Bantry had clearly discovered something significant in those inheritance documents, something that implicated Colonel Hartwell in Catherine Fairfax's death before she could move closer. However, she found her path blocked by Dr. Pemberton, who had approached with obvious intent. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "might I have a word? There's something I think you should know before you proceed with whatever it is you're planning." She allowed him to guide her away from the crowd, toward a quiet corner of the churchyard. "What is it, Doctor?" "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about Mrs. Blackwood's interest in old medical records. There's something I didn't tell you, something that might be important." "Go on." "When she was asking about Catherine Fairfax's death certificate, she mentioned that she'd found something in the church records that didn't match the official version of events. Something about baptismal records that suggested the young woman had been planning a wedding." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "A wedding? To whom?" She wouldn't say directly, but she hinted that the intended groom was someone still living in the village, someone whose reputation would be destroyed if the truth came out. This was a crucial piece of information. If Catherine Fairfax had been engaged to marry someone in Little Fenwick, and if she had died while pregnant with his child, that would provide a powerful motive for murder both 30 years ago and now. "Doctor, did Mrs. Blackwood give you any indication of who this person might be?" "She said something about military records, about someone who had claimed to be unmarried when he enlisted, but who had actually abandoned a pregnant fiancée to her fate." Miss Marple felt the pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. A young soldier departing for war and leaving behind a pregnant fiancée. A woman who died under suspicious circumstances, her pregnancy concealed to protect the man who had abandoned her. And now, 30 years later, that same man living respectably in the village. His secret safe until Mrs. Blackwood began her investigations. Miss Marple. Dr. Pemberton was looking at her with concern. "Are you quite all right?" "Perfectly well, thank you." She looked across the churchyard to where Colonel Hartwell was still in heated conversation with Mrs. Bantry. "Doctor, I wonder if you might do me a small favor." "Of course. Could you create a small disturbance? Nothing serious, just something that would draw everyone's attention for a few moments." Dr. Pemberton looked puzzled, but nodded. He walked toward the crowd and suddenly stumbled, catching himself against a headstone with a dramatic exclamation of pain. Immediately, several people rushed to help him, creating exactly the sort of commotion Miss Marple needed. She approached Colonel Hartwell and Mrs. Bantry, who were so absorbed in their argument they hadn't noticed the distraction. "Won't let you ruin everything now," the colonel was saying. "Too much time has passed. Too many people would be hurt." "Colonel Hartwell," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Mrs. Bantry, such a lovely service, don't you think?" Both of them spun toward her, guilty surprise written across their faces. Mrs. Bantry clutched the documents to her chest, while the colonel took a defensive step backward. "Miss Marple," he said stiffly, "I didn't see you there. I was just admiring the flowers on poor Mrs. Blackwood's grave. Such a tragic end to what should have been a peaceful retirement." She paused, studying both their faces carefully. "Though I suppose secrets from the past have a way of catching up with us eventually, don't they, Colonel?" The effect was immediate. Colonel Hartwell's military bearing crumbled, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been carrying an enormous weight for far too long. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. "Enough," Miss Marple replied gently. "The question is, what are you prepared to do about it?" Mrs. Bantry pressed the documents into Miss Marple's hands. "Show him, Jane. Show him what I found in the inheritance papers. Show him that we know the truth about Catherine Fairfax." Miss Marple examined the documents briefly, her expression growing grave as she read. When she looked up, her eyes held a mixture of sadness and determination. "Colonel Hartwell," she said quietly, "I think it's time we had a very honest conversation about what really happened in 1925 and why Mrs. Blackwood had to die to keep that secret buried.